How many squares does this park have? The first thing that you should have noticed that this is the shape of a rectangle. And of course, yes, always, there are some methods that are easier than other ones. The first one that you can try is count every single square that you have. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this is 6, another 6, another 6, and another 6 will give me 24. That would be one way that you can determine how many squares are inside. Of course, counting squares might be difficult if you have a big amount of squares. In math, we use two methods. First of all, you need to determine that this is what we call the length. Then this is what we call the width. We give them a name so that we can identify which part of the shape we are talking about. And if you notice, I gave myself units. Units is a measurement that we use when we don't have a specific measurement. Measurements that we use, if you recall, can be inches, can be feet, can be centimeters, can be meters. There's many units that we use. In this case, since I have not identified or the distance from each square, we use units. Some of the measurements that we use might be meters, centimeters, feet, inches, yards, etc., depending on what the measurements are referring to. These are just some examples so you get an idea of why I use units instead of meters, centimeters, feet, inches, or yards. Let's find the distance of our length. And what we're going to use is we're going to be counting the distance of every square from one corner to the other to see what will be the distance. This would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And I am going to record the number 6 for the length. I am not going to give it the units in this case. Again, some of the problems will always have it. In this case, I am not going to use a unit because we already said that we just use the word units. Let's identify what is the distance from the width from one corner to the other corner. We can count 1, 2, 3, 4. And again, we are going to be using number 4 only without the units. So we know the width is 4. We know the length is 6. We saw that counting can be an option to determine what is the area of a rectangle. Whenever you have a big area or tons of little squares inside that you cannot be counting, we're going to use a formula that we call area, length, times width. And again, this is only used for the rectangle. Every figure or shape has their own formula. Then we're going to substitute what is the length. The length is 6 times the width. The width is 4. And if you multiply 6 times 4, that will give you 24. Once again, they didn't give us the units, so we're just going to be units. And notice we're going to use the 2 for square. Unit square, why? Because we are talking about squares inside a figure. This is just a simple explanation of what area means and where you can find it and what it means in terms of numerical. So here is your application in real life. You can have a park that looks like a rectangle, and then on the second rectangle, you can see the squares inside. You can count them as we did to get the answer, but it's always more beneficial to use the formula because you don't have to count. And then if they give you decimals or fractions, it will be much easier for you to find the answer instead of counting squares. Can you imagine counting 320 squares inside a rectangle? That would take you forever. So I think now you're ready for a little challenge. Let's do a little challenge here. I am going to give you a rectangle. Let's make a rectangle. And this time, I am not going to give you the measurements. Instead, I am going to give you the area. If the area of this rectangle has 20 squares, and I'm going to say 20 unit squares, give me some possibilities of what the length could be and what the width could be. Take a few seconds or maybe a minute and then come back with your options. I'll give you a hint. You might have more than one answer. I'm gonna go organize my widths, my measurements right here, and my length. Remember that I told you that you had more than one answer? What I usually do to find out, I would try to get myself organized. Start with the width being 1, and the length being 20, because 1 times 20 gives me 20. Of course, your rectangle might be looking a little different than what I have, because if the width is 1, then your length has to be 20. 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20. But since I didn't give you any restrictions, this is also true. Even though the rectangle might not look as the same as this one, that's still true. The area is still 20. You still have 20 squares. Unless you get the restrictions. If the width is 2, then 2 times 10 gives me 20. Of course, we don't have anything of 3 times something gives me 20, so I'm going to skip the 3. The 3 doesn't work, but we know that 4 works. 4 times 5 gives me 20, and that's where I stop, because if I go 5 times something, it's already here. So these are the possible answers. So my answer that might work for this rectangle here, you only have 2 choices. It could be the 2 times 10 or the 4 times 5. The 1 times 20, it's also true, but again, look at the figure. It looks totally different. But again, they didn't give you restrictions, so all those are possible options. And this is what I call reverse thinking, where they give you the area and you are responsible to find the other measurements. If you ever get stuck and you don't know how to find the area of a figure, don't forget that you have the option of actually using grid paper and draw your figure and just count the squares. But the formula, it's always gonna be much faster and easier. If you need help or you need grid paper to actually be able to see the figure, ask your teacher, and your teacher will provide you a copy of the grid paper.